The origin of life is a long-standing and controversial subject. Different hypotheses have been proposed by various scientists and experts to explain the origin of life with no factual data. The fact is, we don't really know exactly how life started, nor understand the intelligence behind this origin. Perhaps there are more questions to ask, more possibilities to consider. This video is an effort to understand the origin of life and the intelligence behind it. Based on the widely accepted theory, Origin of Life by Charles Darwin, we could explain how life adapted to the existing environment by a natural selection process. But the theory could not explain how the first form of life originated from the non-living things on Earth to a complex living organism. Based on the recent advancement in the field of physics, biochemistry, and molecular biology, we now know that life we know today is a very complex form of protein machine. Yes, the molecular protein ball. The primary living form of life is known to be a microscopic structure called cell. Cells are made of different protein molecules, and these proteins are made of different type of amino acids via a process called protein synthesis. Protein synthesis is a very complex process where amino acids are arranged in a specific sequence of chain to form a protein. The proteins that we know today are created from 20 to 30,000 different types of amino acids. Most primitive living things were made up of one cells, called unicellular organisms. Many other living things that we know today are made up of large number of cells that form a plant or animal. These living things are known as multicellular organisms. Am I throwing a lot of details? Let's go with the first principle to understand the life we know. Big Bang Theory, the most convincing theory widely accepted by most scientists today. Big Bang Theory proposed that 13.7 billion years ago, our universe emerged from a singularity. Although no one could explain how everything came from nothing, this is the most accepted theory that can explain how galaxy, stars, sun, solar system could have formed from Big Bang. Let's zoom into the small speck of this universe, our Earth. Approximately 4.6 billion years ago, our solar system was a cloud of dust and gas known as solar nebula. Most likely after a supernova explosion, the gravity collapsed the cloud of dust and gas material in on itself as it began to spin, forming the sun in the center of the nebula. Gravity continued to attract the remaining particles together, clumping them into larger bodies, ultimately forming the Earth and other planets in our solar system. When the Earth cooled down from hot molten material after the supernova, it ended up with hard rocks. These rocks are made up of many different types of elements formed from nebula clouds. These elements existed as crystal inside rocks. Many geological excavation of old rocks that formed many millions and billions of years old shows clear evidence of crystals made of minerals such as nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen that are necessary for amino acid to form. But there were two fundamental issues here. When the Earth formed, the atmosphere did not have oxygen nor water molecules. For amino acid to form, it needs nitrogen, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. It is claimed that the water on Earth probably came from comets or asteroids outside of our solar system, and oxygen molecule might have formed from liquid water. Water is an essential solvent for life to exist. Without water, the life we know today could have not succeeded to survive. Now we have the necessary ingredients to cook the amino acid. But how did the amino acid form naturally on the primitive Earth? To examine this further, let's understand the Urey-Miller experiment. The Urey-Miller experiment was a chemical experiment that simulated the condition thought at the time to be present on the early Earth and tested the chemical origin of life under those conditions. In the 1950s, Harold Urey speculated that the early terrestrial atmosphere was composed of ammonia, methane, and hydrogen. One of his Chicago graduate students was Stanley L. Miller, who showed in the Miller-Urey experiment that if such a mixture were exposed to electric spark and water, it could interact to produce amino acids, which are commonly considered the building block of life. Although this experiment produced only very few types of amino acids, it helped to strengthen the speculation about the chemical origin of life on Earth and elsewhere in the universe. So the chemical reaction of certain components in the early Earth atmosphere is claimed to have produced amino acids. The primitive ingredient necessary for amino acid formation is referred to as primordial soup. Assuming the basic building block is now ready, what other factors are necessary to form a simple living cell? To understand further, it is essential to explore the cell structure in detail. The cell is the basic structural, functional, and biological unit of all known living organisms. Each cell has a specific job to do. The cells that do the same job combine together to form body tissue such as muscle, skin, or bone. Group of different types of cells make up the organs in your body, such as nails, hair, liver, or lungs. To understand, think of cells as microscopic factories. The factories typically contain people, machines, and raw materials. Supplies are brought in to the factory where workers use the supplies to build whatever product the factory makes. Machines in the factory play different roles in that process. Everything works together to create product that the customer needs. Similarly, the cell has several parts that helps in bringing raw materials, that is amino acid, to build proteins via a process called protein synthesis. Ribosome unit within the cell factory is responsible for complex protein synthesis. Different cells have different jobs to do, and they need different proteins to perform specific assigned tasks. For example, the common known cell in our blood are red blood cells. The red blood cells plays a critical function of carrying oxygen. For red blood cell to function, it needs an essential protein called hemoglobin. This protein carries oxygen away from the lungs and carbon dioxide back to the lungs. Another interesting protein is fibrin in the human body. Fibrin, a protein that is produced in response to bleeding during an injury and is a major component of the blood clot. Fibrin is a tough protein substance that combines to form long fibrin thread mesh that entangles platelets, building up a spongy mass that gradually hardens and contracts to form the blood clot. Without this protein, we will end up losing a lot of blood even for a small injury. Even more fascinating is that there are certain proteins that can walk and are responsible for transfer of proteins and other signaling messages between the cells, literally like a cargo unit of the factory. These proteins are called motor proteins. They literally convert chemical energy to mechanical energy and walk on the structure called microtubes.
These are molecular motors involved with a directed transport along the mitotic spindle. The orange proteins walking to the left are kinesins, molecular motors carrying proteins on their back. Striding from the kinetochore on long molecular legs are dynein, carrying the stop signal broadcasting system.
How exciting, right? These cells are small molecular robots that perform a various function using different proteins within our body to help us survive. Hope you understand the critical role of amino acids and how it helps to build different protein molecules necessary for various cells to function. Let's make it more interesting now. Most proteins that we consume or we find in inorganic components are usually non-functional. That is, a molecular cell cannot function with such a simple, linear structure of protein molecules. Unless protein takes a specific three-dimensional structure by coiling and folding, they cannot perform a biological function which is necessary for a living cell to exist. The DNA in the cell plays a critical role in storing and instructing cells on how to generate specific proteins in the right sequence with the right folding structure. The DNA protein by design cannot move across the cell. Remember, the cell is a factory with various working units. Some of the instruction about the protein synthesis needs to move from DNA to a unit called ribosome where the protein synthesis happens. There comes another transport unit in the factory called mRNA, also called messenger RNA. This mRNA protein copies the instruction from DNA to ribosome unit, like a photocopy machine. This mRNA provides instruction to ribosome, and ribosome then uses another protein called tRNA, also called transport RNA, to bring necessary amino acids together in the right sequence to build protein. This process is called replication. Every day in your body, around 50 to 70 billion cells die due to various reasons such as cell damage and aging. So cell replication is a vital process to create new cell in your body. What you're about to see is an extraordinary animation created by Walter and Elisa Hollister about the DNA and replication process.
Using computer animation based on molecular research, we are now able to see how DNA is actually copied in living cells. You are looking at an assembly line of amazing miniature biochemical machines that are pulling apart the DNA double helix and cranking out a copy of each strand. The DNA to be copied enters the production line from bottom left. The whirling blue molecular machine is called helicase. It spins the DNA as fast as a jet engine as it unwinds the double helix into two strands. One strand is copied continuously and can be seen spooling off to the right. Things are not so simple for the other strand because it must be copied backwards. It is drawn out repeatedly in loops and copied one section at a time. The end result is two new DNA molecules. In this animation, we'll see the remarkable way our DNA is tightly packed up so that 6 feet of this long molecule fits into the microscopic nucleus of every cell. The process starts when DNA is wrapped around special protein molecules called histones. The combined loop of DNA and protein is called a nucleosome. Next, the nucleosomes are packaged into a thread. The end result is a fiber known as chromatin. This fiber is then looped and coiled yet again. Leading finally to the familiar shapes known as chromosomes, which can be seen in the nucleus of dividing cells. Chromosomes are not always present. They form around the time cells divide when the two copies of the cell's DNA need to be separated.
Amazing, right? Now going back to the question where we initially started, on a planet Earth full of raw chemical materials, how the necessary ingredients consistently came together in a workable way for life to originate. What accident of nature led to the first tiny glimmer of the living cell to originate and have so much of intelligence in it? Let's investigate this further. Using basic mathematics of probability, for a simple, fully functioning living cell to be created, it is estimated that at least 150 types of amino acids are needed to synthesize necessary protein molecules. Researchers have calculated that the probability of self-assembling a small single protein through a blind chemical reaction with 150 type of amino acid from the primordial soup was 1 chance in the 10 to the power of 164. That is one correctly sequenced protein chain for every 100 million trillion 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 atoms. The question now is, how long would it take for such a random sequencing to complete with right protein folding for a known simplest protein to be created? As per the current known method of determining the age of planetary objects, we now know our Earth is 4.6 billion years old. With a self-assembly rate of 150 amino acid chain at 1 chain per second, a successful protein chain creation will be far longer than the expected age of the Earth formation. To visualize this madness of randomness, imagine an astronaut goes 1 million miles away in space. The astronaut randomly fires a laser in any direction and he happens to hit a particular person on the end part of a particular strand of hair. Now the chances of DNA formation are as if the astronaut hit the same person on the same strand of hair randomly 10 times in a row, all from 1 million miles in space. Assuming that we accept this randomness, we still have few more open questions which remain unanswered. Imagine for the first cell to originate, it needs many different proteins to form units such as nucleus, cell membrane, ribosome, etc. How could all ingredients came together in the same place at the same time for the first cell to form? Even in the book Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, published in 1859, he clearly mentions that all organic beings that lived on Earth could be descended from some primordial form. But there is no clear explanation of how the first form of life originated. Francis Crick, who was awarded the Nobel Prize for discovery of DNA, quoted that an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appeared at the moment to be almost a miracle. I'm completely baffled on how to explain the origin of life without an intelligent factor that could have influenced the creation of life we know. It could be either possible that life originated outside the Earth from another unknown part of the universe and we are merely an adapted form of this life on Earth, or was there any other element that expedited and influenced the design of this life form we know on Earth? Even if life was created outside the Earth, still the question remains valid until we know what the intelligence was behind such creation of life. If you step back and look at DNA sequence, and the ability of a cell to process and create multiple copies by itself is really fascinating. But where did the information in the cell come from? How did the cell complex information processing system arise? If one whole cell DNA was uncoiled and its information is stretched out, then it would be 6 feet long. Also, the scientists has estimated that if all the coded information from one cell of one person were printed on books, then it would fill a library of 4,000 books. And if the whole body DNA were positioned continuously, it would extend from our Earth to Moon more than 500,000 times. Clearly, the information feature of the cell at least appears designed and not formed randomly. Also, it is estimated that a single gram of DNA with a volume of 1 centimeter cube can hold as much information as a trillion compact disc, that is approximately 750 terabyte of data. Today we have tons and tons of rack-mounted storage and processing units to handle information on silicon-based computers. I now really feel how primitive we are in processing and storing information compared to the unknown intelligence design we see within our cell. Scientists have already started storing digital data in DNA since 2012, and the DNA-based storage technology is being improvised to make it practical for everyday use. The power of sequential computing we could achieve using the molecular design is even more fascinating. Let's look at the read and write rate of DNA. In bacteria, the DNA replicates at the rate of 500 base pairs of chromosome a second. But this is only 1000 bits per second, which is a snail pace when compared to the data throughput of an average hard drive. But look what happens if you allow many copies of the replication enzyme to work on DNA in parallel. First of all, the replication enzyme can start on the second replicated strand of DNA even before they have finished copying the first one. So already the data rate jumped to 2000 bits per second. But look what happens after each replication is finished. The number of DNA strands increases exponentially. With each additional strand, the data rate increased by 1000 bits per second. So after 10 iterations, the DNA is being replicated at the rate of about 1 megabits per second. After 30 iterations, it increases to 1000 gigabits per second. This is beyond the sustained data rate of the fastest hard drive we ever had. Imagine what would be the computing power of all human cells. We have 100 trillion cells in our body. We can take more inspiration from the working of our cells to further improve the architecture and performance of our silicon-based computers. How is it possible that a non-living element transforms into such an intelligent, complex living thing? It is hard to conclude that there is no intelligence behind the origin of life, and we don't just exist by chance. If we carefully observe our nature's ecosystem, it reveals more evidence of intelligent design in the evolution process. This is a tree of life, a model to explore the evolution in the human point of view. According to evolution theory, first life began in the sea with single cellular organism, bacteria, and then later evolved into variations called eukaryotes, plants, fungi, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and finally to mammals. We humans are part of mammals. Assuming the theory is valid, where did the evolution get this intelligence to define the target state to reach from one form to another? If survival is the only necessity of living being, why evolution did not stop with a single cellular organism developing all necessary bells and whistles to survive in various ecosystems? Why it has to evolve into so many species? Today it is estimated that we have 8.7 million species on this planet Earth. What is the need for having so many species if survival is the basic necessity? Mutations are the raw materials of evolution. A mutation is a change in the sequence of an organism's DNA. It is currently believed that the evolution of an organism is simply via random mutation. Can all the 8.7 million species on Earth just came via random mutation without having any intelligence? It is hard to believe all mutation is random. Let's look at the evidence of design in species which does not appear to be a random mutation. Human eye is considered to be one of the most complex biological image processing systems that can translate photons from the light into an image that an organism can understand and respond to it. It's hard to believe that random mutation with natural selection resulted in such a complex organ. Our brain and consciousness is another example of intelligence in us. Until today, there is no clear understanding of the consciousness and how it works. The way neuroscientists tend to decode the world into their explanation of consciousness is by thinking of neurons and neural processes carrying and transferring information signals. I believe our understanding of life and origin is still at a very early stage. Even if we decode and understand how these phenomena works, still the question of how it got in first place and who designed it is still a mystery to solve. Let's look at plants and intelligence in their functioning. In northern hemisphere, trees shed their leaves during autumn as cold weather approaches. Many types of trees shed their leaves as a strategy to survive harsh weather conditions. As unfavorable weather approaches, hormones in the tree trigger the process of abscission, whereby the leaves are actively cut off the tree by a specialized cell. As part of the abscission process, trees reabsorb valuable nutrients from their leaves and store them for later use in their roots. How fascinating that a tree could sense the condition of its environment and has intelligence to survive the harsh weather. How did plants get this intelligence? Can this intelligence come from a random mutation? In one of the interesting TED Talk by Susan Simard, a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia, explains how the plants communicate. Her team's analysis revealed that the fungi network in symbiosis with plant root system help to move water, carbon and nutrition such as nitrogen between and among trees as well as cross species. The research has demonstrated that these complex symbiotic networks in our forest mimic our own neural and social network. But the point to ponder is, how did plant get this intelligence in the first place to form a complex mesh network and transport various needed nutrients to other plants in the forest? Can this be a pure random mutation? Let's look at more examples of intelligence in evolution. Migrating birds can cover thousands of miles in their annual travels, often traveling the same course year after year with little deviation. First year, birds often make their very first migration on their own. Somehow they can find their winter home despite never having seen it before, and return the following spring to where they were born. What is the secret of their amazing navigation skill? Recently, scientists have discovered evidence that birds' eyes can sense the Earth's magnetic field. The cryptochromes in their eyes are responsible for their ability to orient themselves by detecting Earth's magnetic field, a sense called magnetoreception. How complex could a cell evolve to detect the weak magnetic field? Can this evolution be a mere random mutation with no intelligence? Hummingbird is another most interesting bird with highest metabolism of any warm-blooded animal that can hover like drones and can even fly backward. Probably the only bird that can fly backward. Its wings beat furiously 80 times a second. Hummingbird drink the nectar found in feeders by moving their tongues in and out about 13 times per second. How did the evolution get such intelligence to evolve into a complex species? Is it a pure random mutation without any intelligence? The life and the ecosystem we know is very complex but beautiful. There is more clear evidence of intelligence in the life we know, but no answers yet how this intelligence came into existence. Much scientific community does not agree to non-factual statement of intelligence that cannot be explained scientifically. It's like having an intelligent technology from nowhere, and we know how to use it, but we don't know how it got created in the first place. There is a lot of unanswered questions regarding the origin. We tend to bound ourselves to the logical knowledge and does not open doors for new thoughts which might not sound reasonable from a scientific standpoint. Our understanding of this life and universe is still at a primitive stage. We don't even understand an atom, the basic building block of this life, to its fullest. Much of what we don't understand about the origin and this life is simply in our heads. Let's enjoy this intelligence and preserve our nature. Thank you.